So hello and welcome to Making History Together, the 75th story of the Southern Oregon Historical Society, our Windows in Time program presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I'm Carrie Tannehill, Head of Adult Services. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera if you do not want your video included in the recording. Recording of this program will be uploaded to the JCLS Beyond YouTube channel within 2 weeks. There will be time to answer your questions at the end of this program. Please put them in the chat box if they come up during Alice's presentation, or once the recording is stopped, we will be doing a Q&A time after her presentation. So the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. Today's presenter is Alice. She's a retired teacher and longtime volunteer at the Southern Oregon Southern Oregon Historical Society Research Library in the also at Hanley Farm. She has written several articles and given several talks for SOHS, and she recently completed a timeline of the 75-year history of SOHS. So thank you, Alice, for being with us today, and I will give it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. We're going to set up the screen sharing now. The story of the Southern Oregon Historical Society is one of people, their vision, dedication, perseverance. And its beginning centers around the 1883 courthouse, seen here in the 1920s, and in preserving pioneer history. I love this photograph because the streets are such an awful mess. Anyway, the Southern Oregon Historical Society might have been 100 years old this year instead of 75 years old, because there was a group that formed and called their organization the Southern Oregon Historical Society in 1921. But after 2 newspaper articles, there is no more mention of this society. But there were museums of sorts, at any rate. Herman Helms started one of them in his Table Rock Saloon in Jacksonville in the early 1850s. It was called a cabinet of curiosities, and most things in it were natural phenomena, like a mastodon tusk that were brought in to put on display. About 1915, Alice Applegate Sargent of the Applegate family started a museum in the old Bruner building in Jacksonville with much of her own family collection. And the Southern Oregon Pioneer Association, which had been founded in 1876, authorized a museum in the late 1920s to go in the old U.S. hotel seen here. And Alice and Claire Hanley helped collect artifacts for this museum and ran it. You will hear more of this pioneer Hanley family that had a significant role in the Historical Society. But please notice that there is no balcony on the U.S. hotel. By the 1930s, there was a strong community interest in saving the old Jacksonville County Courthouse. It had been built in 1883 and abandoned in 1926 when voters moved the county seat to Medford. As World War II was coming to an end, people began to look forward again, and the Sons of the American Revolution decided to make saving the old courthouse their project for 1945. Clarence Meeker, then mayor of Medford and a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, agreed to this project and began to gather people together who could make it work. He met with leaders of the DAR and the Pioneer Association, area political and education leaders, and after a year of talking, they formed the Southern Oregon Historical Society in his office in February 1946, 75 years ago. It was a rough next couple of years, though the county commissioners, then called judges, were behind them all the way. A big roadblock was funding to restore the old building and then to operate it as a museum. The solution would be a tax levy, but that couldn't be done without enabling legislation from the state legislature. So the whole of 1947 was taken up with local state legislators getting the bill passed that would allow a local levy for history. It passed almost without comment and was used by many other counties. Ironically, the same thing would happen again later in 2015. Finally, in 1948, the history levy was on the November ballot and passed with a 300 vote margin out of over 14,000 votes cast. The public was willing to pay property taxes to save the old courthouse and have a museum of pioneer history. It would be another year before tax money was available because it isn't collected until November. So November of 1949, work began restoring the building, hiring a caretaker and a curator, and collecting artifacts. A little side story here. Flora Lawrence of longtime Lawrence's jewelry store in Medford offered to sell a display case for a reduced price to the new museum. Instead of charging $175, she would only charge $150. Such generosity. It's very important to get the museum open. Hiring a museum professional for a couple of months from the Oregon Historical Society to handle exhibits was a great way to do it. August 5th, 1950, during Jacksonville's Gold Rush Jubilee celebrations, over 7,000 people toured the museum on its opening day. Claire Hanley was now president of the Board of Trustees and welcomed dignitaries from other historical societies around the state and the region.
Alice, you're kind of muffled with your volume. Did something happen?
Okay.
That's better. Now we can hear you. It's just sounded kind of distant and we couldn't hear.
It was too far away, maybe. Is this better?
Yeah, that is a lot better. Thank you.
In only 2.5 years, the museum celebrated their 100,000th visitor, and within 20 years, honored their 1,000,000th visitor. The museum was a huge success. The first meeting of the Board of Trustees after opening the museum, they made two important decisions. First, they would accept all artifacts donated to the museum. And the second was that they, in order to preserve other historical structures, the county would own them and the Historical Society would restore and manage them. And this policy lasted a long time. Donations poured in, including what had been the Pioneer Society Museum and Alice Applegate Sargent's collection. As was the style of museums at the time, items were grouped together by kind with little explanation. So there were exhibit cases of guns and silver, and dresses and tools, and so forth. It was thought the courthouse would cost up to $90,000 to restore, but the price came in at less than $30,000. So within a couple of years, the courthouse, collections, and museum staff were paid for, and there was money left over. Peter Britt, who was an important pioneer photographer, his house was offered to the Southern Oregon Historical Society. There were also offers of pioneer banker Cornelius Beekman's house and bank. The U.S. Hotel needed work and managing, and there were many other buildings in need. The trustees went slowly and helped the Oregon Historical Society with restoring the Beekman Bank, but turned down the house. Then they turned down the Britt house and accepted only the studio instead of the whole house. Here we see the studio in the Britt house on the left and in a reconstructed museum exhibit a few years later in the museum. By the end of the decade, 1959, the society had about 250 members paying $2 a year, and we're getting about $35,000 a year from the tax levy. For the next 25 years, the Historical Society's growth is phenomenal. The collection got a facelift and the upstairs courtroom was professionally set up thanks to a large grant. And this included exhibit cases and the Judge Hannah's courthouse. The style was still to show like things together. Now there was a rock room, an Indian room, a toy room seen here, a gown room, and so forth. Buildings were being obtained right and left as Jacksonville itself was being restored. Here's a challenge for you. This is a photo of some of the buildings the Society restored and managed, and a list of them on the right. They're not all pictured. I wish it were live so I could call on you, but let me give you a minute and then I'll tell you what they are. Some buildings were restored and used by the Southern Oregon Historical Society, and some found new uses. The old Rogue River Valley Railroad Depot became the Chamber of Commerce Visitors Center. The Methodist Church was turned back into a church. So let's identify these buildings. Upper left is the Catholic Rectory. To the right of that is the Rogue River Valley Railroad Jacksonville Depot. The lower left is the Beekman Bank. Then the U.S. Hotel, now with its balcony restored. And the lower right is the Methodist Church. A number of other properties were bought, including the Armstrong House, which was used as a museum and then later office space and is now a private residence again. The Society bought a number of houses around the museum to use for storage and office space, both of which were always at a premium. Professional curating of the materials in the collection was recognized as essential in the 1970s because of some serious problems. In 1974, the FBI contacted the museum and said they had captured someone with a collection of gold nuggets and coins who said he got them from the Jacksonville Museum. Well, first of all, the Historical Society hadn't missed their collection, and worse yet, they had no record of it. So they couldn't prove it was theirs and couldn't claim it. It was not the first theft, and it was not the last. This photo is taken of a Wairika collection that was stolen and returned just a few years ago. The museum also lost valuable knives and rifles and Native American artifacts. And then the last straw happened in 1980 when 2 storage units the Society rented burned to the ground. You guessed it, there was no inventory of what was in them. All they could say was that they'd lost 6 of 9 pump organs that they had been donated to the Society. It was past time to properly record and document all artifacts. Immediately, a registrar was hired to do the job. This long row of file cabinets in the History Center today holds the result of that work. Most artifacts have legal papers of ownership and are also recorded electronically using a professional museum program. Today's project, should you be interested in helping out, is to digitize this 75 years of legal records for the approximately 1 million artifacts that are held by the Society. By 1969, the revenue from the tax levy is up to $84,000, but membership is down to 73. So the Society recognized a need to serve more people as it continued to grow. They began publication of books and magazines. They hired their first archivist to handle the library, which took over a second room in the museum, but was still overflowing with materials. History bus tours became very popular. The first one went to the King Tut exhibit in Seattle, and 300 people participated. The society held art shows, harvest fairs, an award-winning TV series called Share the Spirit. A major Eugene Bennett art show was held here, and Brit photos went to a gallery in New York City. Trail markers were created for the bicentennial in 1976. Walking tours were held in Jacksonville, Medford, and Ashland. Events just for children were also held. This is a special festival held for children in 1976. Children's programming culminated in the establishment of a special museum just for children, one in which all exhibits are hands-on. You could touch, hear, and feel history, not just look at it. And the old jail was a perfect spot for it. Children had nooks devoted to school or kitchen or Native American storytelling and many other things, and could operate a telephone exchange. Special exhibits ranged from Bozo the Clown, created by Pinto Colvig, who was from Jacksonville, to a model railroad that children could run in scenes recognizable as the Road Valley, like this Ashland Depot Hotel. Living history programs were begun at the Beekman House, where people could visit the Beekmans and experience them in their home or bank. History was not just to be viewed, but lived. All this required additional staff and funding. This attention to the activities for the public worked. By 1976, membership, shown here in yellow, grew to 800. The history level, shown in green, increased to over $600,000. There were now 20 employees. Though increased and innovative program brought in many more members, the History Fund grew for two different reasons. One was the discovery that the formula used to calculate the amount of the fund was incorrect, and the fund amount should be double what it had been. Then the county tax base was growing rapidly as the county itself grew. New county financial problems, though, caused tensions between the Historical Society and the county. While the history levy grew, O&C funding for the county began shrinking, and the county was hurting for funds. They asked for loans from the history levy. SOHS have always been pack rats. It's true. Storage became more and more and more acute. The old jail had been the main storage building, but with the opening of the Children's Museum, SOHS had things stored in the U.S. Hotel ballroom, the power company substation. At least two buildings behind the museum were built for the purpose. They had about 4 houses in the vicinity of the museum and rented storage units. There were lots of schemes to save up money to build a single collection storage facility. One was a sinking fund that the county agreed to hold for us, but soon needed for their own budget, and it legally disappeared. The society started saving again. All these financial considerations led to a more planned growth. Starting in the mid-1980s, several projects brought new focus and expanded service. Mary Hanley, who had been curator from 1955 to 1969, was that last surviving member of her family at the Willows. In 1982, she gave that farm to the Southern Oregon Historical Society. Her wish was that there would always be farmland so people could see what farm life was like in earlier years. Hanley Farm brought about archaeological digs with significant Native American findings, agricultural studies for best practice, new programming that brought people onto the land. This was the first property actually owned by the Southern Oregon Historical Society. Programming was expanded at the farm. Farm activities fostered new partnerships with groups like Spinners and Weavers, Civil War reenactment groups, Society for Creative Anachronism, and many civic groups. And for a couple of years, the local Working Horse Group planted and harvested wheat, which Butte Creek Mill ground into Hanley horsepower flour. In the late 1980s, the long-awaited collection storage building was finally built on county land in White City. And at long last, the artifacts could be brought together in one place and stored under proper conditions of temperature and humidity. The dream of having artifacts properly preserved was finally realized. And this was the second property owned by the Southern Oregon Historical Society. And finally, the Southern Oregon Historical Society purchased the old J.C. Penney's building in Medford, used to house yet another museum and society offices, the third building owned by the society. New museums were established, including Ashland's Chapel Swedenborg House, which after restoration became the SOU Alumni Center. That museum then moved to the old Armory in Ashland for a while. By the mid-1990s, the Society was managing 27 historic properties, 3 museums, a living history farm, with a staff of 40 and a tax levy revenue of over $1 million. There were 15 smaller historical societies in communities all over the county that were able to use levy money for buildings, staff, collections, preservation, exhibits, and programs. The Society had an award-winning publication, a daily radio program, as it was, 3 stores, including one at the Rogue Valley Mall, and major exhibits in all the museums, as well as special exhibits like the celebration at the airport for the 75th anniversary of airmail flight in the Valley. An education department not only provided exhibits and activities for the Children's Museum, but developed Children's Heritage Fair for 4th grade students all over Southern Oregon. It serves from 1,000 to 3,000 school children each year and will celebrate its 35th anniversary next year. In addition, there were history lessons with hands-on activities in trunks that went out to classrooms. Family programming was held in the summer months at the Beekman House and the Hanley Farm. The focus of museums had changed, and SOHS changed with them. Instead of arrays of things in an exhibit case, exhibits became more focused on a theme, like railroads in Southern Oregon, or the advance of the fruit industry, or Miner Baker furniture maker, looking at the jobs people had, or these that are mentioned in the exhibit, in the on the slide. This approach culminated in a traveling exhibit of the Magna Carta straight from England. It was set up in the U.S. Hotel Ballroom with props from Oregon Shakespeare Festival's production of King John, which had happened that year. And 15,000 people attended across 10 days at Thanksgiving time, some waiting in our famous freezing fog for hours to get in. The Society partnered with other groups on conferences of significant issues to people of the Valley, like this one in 1990. The research library had moved to the new History Center in Medford with finally enough room to house all the 2-dimensional artifacts and a comfortable reading room. That is where they are today. With nearly 100,000 photographic images, 68,000 of which have been digitized, 1,000 transcribed oral histories, over 1,000 manuscript collections, including things like the minutes of the Order of Red Men in German, and a copy of the Treaty of Table Rock from 1853. Business ledgers, letters, on and on. A couple of the larger manuscript collections are the Medco Company records, including the Pacific and Eastern Railroad, and the Fruit Growers League papers. There are hundreds of maps, vertical files of newspaper clippings, films, and so forth. Amazingly, many of these items are indexed online. So you can look ahead of time on our website and see what we have before coming in to actually view them Tuesday through Friday from noon to 4. This is currently a volunteer-run enterprise with public library help to provide professional library assistance in exchange for our resources being free to public library card holders. In 1996, Measure 47 was passed by Oregon voters, limiting the annual increases on property taxes to 3%. That meant a 14% reduction in levy money coming to SOHS in 1997. And then in 1997, Measure 50 passed to clean up Measure 47. And that allowed all levies to be rolled into the county general fund to be used at the discretion of the county commissioners. In Jackson County, that affected a number of entities, including the public library system, as well as historical societies. Finally, the county monetary woes were eased by reducing monies to those groups. So, for example, the public libraries closed for several months. Some of the groups passed their own separate districts with levies to go with them, with no connection to the county, like the library district. The arrangement made with the county for historical societies was to decrease the amount given to them from the general fund each year until the last payment would be made in 2007. So as we look at the graph again, this time for the full 75 years of the society, instead of receiving over $1 million from the history level, as was true in the mid-1990s, by the mid-2000s, the levy brought historical societies nothing. So it was that SOHS began to do with less and less. Staff was dramatically reduced. Program offerings were reduced. Fundraisers and grants were sought to make up the difference. Exhibits were limited, and exhibit space in the History Center was rented. Award-winning smaller traveling exhibits were developed by staff and volunteers called Making History Together. Larger exhibits were put into other buildings, like the 60s exhibit in the Woolworths building and the Women in Farming and Chinese Experience in the Rogue Valley Mall. Exhibits reflected new directions in museums by involving communities in the development of an exhibit, addressing edgier issues, and including interactive aspects always. A low point came in 2010 when the society was being asked by the county to maintain county-owned buildings with no tax funds. That led to moving out of all county-owned properties, including the Jacksonville Museum, U.S. Hotel, the Beekman House and Bank, and others. The society retreated to the buildings it owned. The History Center in Medford, which was rented out to first Lithia Motors and then Kid Time, except for the research library, the collections storage facility in White City, and Hanley Farm, which is currently rented to the Family Nurturing Center, except for the historic core. For 6 months, everything closed and was reevaluated. Longtime volunteers stepped up to reopen the library and have some events at Hanley Farm. The Gold Diggers Guild, which we'll talk about more later, continued to fund Children's Heritage Fair, but at Hanley Farm instead of all over Jacksonville. As it was, volunteers continued to produce daily radio programming. A speakers series was begun with the public library system called Windows in Time, and here you are in our 12th year. All these things done with volunteers. The society launched a major effort to pass a heritage district, like the library district, which the county agreed to put on the ballot with the unfortunate choice of the November 2016 election. You remember that year? The levy failed, the district failed, and the last of the employees was laid off by the Board of Trustees. There was only one direction to go, and that was up. Volunteer efforts at the Research Library and Hanley Farm continued. A new magazine was started called the Southern Oregon Historical Society Quarterly, which I hope many of you receive. A website has been developed on which you can find huge amounts of information, from events to online exhibits. Most amazing of all, the collection containing nearly 1 million artifacts is as carefully preserved as ever. Again, thanks to volunteers. New artifacts are still being accepted and properly documented. Programs at Hanley Farm continue. Large numbers of archives are now online with indexes to most of the other items in the research library. Grants help with major repairs and renovations. SOHS has been able to live within its means. At every stage of the Southern Oregon Historical Society's 75 years, it is people who have made a difference. With staff, volunteers, and members, SOHS has adapted and continued to make history available to others. We need to give credit to these people that were making history for the last 75 years. The Gold Diggers Guild, formed in the 1970s, is a group of women interested in history with the dual purpose of learning more about local history and a social setting, and raising money for special projects at SOHS. They held receptions, fashion shows, upscale garage sales, and they still support the mission of the Historical Society. If you would like to join them, just call the research library and ask for Vicki. The Jacksonville Museum Quilters used space in the U.S. Hotel for their meetings and shows every year, and every year created a group quilt centered on history, local history. Those quilts today are at the Genealogical Society archives, and they give frequent presentations using them. They're wonderful presentations. There was a community theater group called the Jacksonville Museum Players, and they wrote and performed plays for school groups, nursing homes, and society events. Currently, there's a new group of players being formed to bring back that history. And I can connect you with the volunteer putting that together if you're interested. It's always the people who made the difference. Like these staff. Mary Hanley, who was curator from 1955 to 1969 and gave her heritage farm to the society. The staff, the Beekman House that expanded the program base there to serve more and more people. Ida Clearwater, who was a library assistant during very trying times of way too many archives and way too little space. All of the directors who have guided the society through the years and continue to preserve the huge collection during good times and bad. All the professional staff making do with sometimes awful conditions. All the groups, businesses, and individuals the Historical Society has the privilege of partnering with on so many projects. All those who've served on,
volunteers.
All the volunteers who've done everything from guide visitors to scrub toilets to serve on committees and everything in between that was needed by the society. And all the boards of trustees and foundation boards who have given so much to the success of the society. They have made history together from the beginning. Members are more important than ever. The society, with volunteer help, earned income, grants, donations, and memberships, has been able to bring back 3 full-time equivalent staff, and with 150 active volunteers, is now readying itself to take a step forward into a new phase. This 75th year is an exciting time to be part of SOHS. We'd love to have you join us. The first 75 years have seen highs and lows, but always the Southern Oregon Historical Society has worked to fulfill its mission to collect, preserve, and share the stories of our history. You can be proud to be part of this as a member, a donor, a volunteer, and yes, even an audience. Thank you.